On a humid summer night in Harlem, two young men's lives were rewritten forever. Charles Collins and Brian Boles, sons, brothers, dreamers, were suddenly thrust into a nightmare they never imagined. A brutal crime had shaken their neighborhood, and though neither man had any connection to it, suspicion fell on them like a shadow they could not escape. The evidence was thin, the witnesses uncertain, but the machinery of justice moved swiftly, as if the verdict had already been carved in stone. Overnight, Charles and Brian were branded as criminals. Their families watched helplessly as courtrooms became cages, and truth was buried under the weight of assumption. For decades, they sat behind bars. Days turned to years, years to lifetimes stolen. Harlem grew, changed, and moved on, but inside cold prison walls, time froze for Charles and Brian. Their innocence screamed into silence, their stories erased by a system that had already decided who they were. But then a breakthrough. Hidden files, long-buried doubts, and whispers of new evidence began to surface. Could the truth, after all these years, finally claw its way back into the light? This is not just a story of two men wrongfully convicted. It's a story of Harlem itself, of a community betrayed, of families broken, and of a fight for justice that refused to die. Before we dive into this chilling and unforgettable story, make sure to hit like and subscribe for more wrongful conviction true crime investigations. Because Charles and Brian's fight for justice is just beginning, and every shocking revelation brings us closer to uncovering the truth hidden in plain sight. This is the story of Charles Collins and Brian Boles. The winter air in Harlem in February 1994 was sharp enough to cut through bone. The sidewalks carried the residue of old snow, stained with the grit of the city, while neon lights from corner bodegas flickered weakly against the cold. On West 143rd Street, inside a dimly lit apartment, a neighbor's knock went unanswered. Inside lay a crime that would ripple through Harlem, and decades later, the nation. James Reed was 85 years old. By every account, he was a quiet man, a fixture in the building, known for his polite greetings and the hum of his old radio. But on that cold February day, the hum was gone. Neighbors grew suspicious when they hadn't seen him for days. When the door was finally forced open, what greeted investigators was not the calm stillness of an old man's apartment. It was horror. The room was in disarray. Drawers had been pulled out, belongings scattered across the floor. A lamp lay broken in the corner, and in the middle of it all was Reed's body. He had been beaten. A telephone cord was wound tight around his neck. His fingernails told their own story, signs of struggle, skin cells trapped beneath them, silent testimony waiting to be heard. The crime scene was a brutal puzzle, but one thing was clear: Harlem was shaken. To understand how quickly suspicion would fall, and why police leapt to a conclusion that would destroy two young lives, you have to understand Harlem at the time. In the early 1990s, Harlem was a community both resilient and weary. Crime rates in New York City had soared through the 1980s and early 90s, fueled by poverty, drugs, and policing strategies that often cast entire neighborhoods as suspects. For many families, life was a daily negotiation between survival and hope. Police faced mounting pressure to curb crime, especially violent crime against vulnerable residents like James Reed. The murder of an elderly man inside his own home demanded a swift response. Public fear demanded it. The headlines were already being drafted before the facts had time to settle. Charles Collins and Brian Boles were both 17. They lived in the same building as James Reed, boys navigating the difficult streets of Harlem in the 1990s. They weren't saints. Like many teenagers, they got into trouble. Just days before Reed's body was discovered, The two had been picked up in connection with a robbery. It was enough to put them on the radar, enough to make detectives, under pressure to solve the case, look at them not as teenagers, but as suspects. What Collins and Boles could not have known, as they sat in that precinct holding room, was that their lives were about to be rewritten. They would be pulled into the machinery of a justice system that was less interested in truth than in closure. In the days following the discovery of Reed's body, newspapers painted Harlem in broad strokes: dangerous streets, an elderly man murdered in cold blood, a community under siege. The NYPD, facing criticism for rising crime, needed a win. They needed suspects they could point to quickly. Detectives zeroed in on Collins and Boles. They lived in the building. They had recently been arrested. And, most importantly, they were young, malleable in the eyes of seasoned interrogators. There was no DNA analysis done then, no careful forensic investigation tying them to the crime. There was no eyewitness placing them inside Reed's apartment. What there was pressure. Pressure to close a case. Pressure to reassure Harlem that the streets were safer than they felt. For a 17-year-old, a police interrogation room is a world designed to strip away defenses. Harsh lights, cold chairs, hours of silence broken by bursts of accusation. For adults, it can be intimidating. For teenagers, it is terrifying. Detectives began to press. They told Collins and Boles they had evidence, even when they didn't. They told them they would face life in prison, or worse, if they didn't cooperate. They hinted at leniency if they just admitted what the detectives wanted to hear. Both boys denied involvement at first, but hours turned to days. Sleep deprivation set in. Fear did the rest. By the time their interrogations ended, both boys had confessed to a murder they had not committed. Once the confessions were in hand, the narrative solidified. The details in the statements were inconsistent, riddled with contradictions, but that didn't matter. For police, prosecutors, and even much of the press, the story was clear. Two teenagers had killed their elderly neighbor. That story would define them for the next 3 decades. In Harlem, the news was met with a complicated silence. Some residents were relieved that suspects had been arrested. Others questioned the narrative. But in a time when distrust between police and community ran deep, voices of doubt rarely carried weight. For Collins and Boles' families, the arrests were devastating. Their sons were just boys. They knew they weren't killers. But once the system begins to move against you, especially in the 1990s, it is almost impossible to stop. With the confessions secured, the machinery of the criminal justice system rolled forward. Prosecutors had what they needed. Defense attorneys were left scrambling. Collins and Boles were no longer just teenagers. They were defendants in a murder trial. But beneath the surface of certainty, cracks had already formed. The timeline didn't make sense. Witnesses contradicted the state's case. The physical evidence was thin at best. And yet, none of it would matter. Because the most powerful evidence in the courtroom would not be forensic science or eyewitness accounts. It would be the boys' own words. Words forced out of them in a room they were too young and too scared to navigate. By the time the city moved on, 2 young men's lives had been altered forever. And as the courtroom doors opened for the first hearings, the fate of Charles Collins and Brian Boles was sealed, not by truth, not by justice, but by the confessions that detectives had wrung out of them in the dead of night. The question wasn't whether they were guilty. The question, for the system, was how quickly it could convince everyone else that they were. The summer of 1994 in Harlem was a paradox. On one hand, it pulsed with energy, stoop conversations, kids dribbling basketballs against cracked pavement, bodegas alive with salsa music drifting into the humid air. On the other, it carried a heavy undertone. Crime rates were high, distrust between residents and police ran deep, and justice often felt like something reserved for a different zip code. It was in this climate that Charles Collins, then 20 years old, and his childhood friend, 22-year-old Brian Boles, found themselves in the wrong place at the wrong time, or rather, accused of being in the wrong place at the wrong time. On the night of July 1994, gunfire erupted on 125th Street. Witnesses described chaos, a scuffle, voices raised, and then sudden bursts of shots cracking the air like fireworks. One man, a local hustler with known ties to street disputes, collapsed onto the sidewalk. Sirens followed minutes later, and within hours, detectives were canvassing the neighborhood for leads. This wasn't just any shooting, it was high profile. Harlem had been in the headlines for violence all summer, and city officials were under pressure to show results. The NYPD needed arrests, fast. By sunrise, rumors spread that 2 young black men had been seen fleeing the scene. No one knew their names, but the vague description, tall, slim build, dark clothing, could have applied to half the young men in the neighborhood. Still, detectives would soon zero in on Charles Collins and Brian Boles. Charles was a college hopeful, juggling community college classes with shifts at a hardware store. Brian, quieter by nature, had just started a job as a delivery driver. Neither had serious trouble with the law. Yet, when officers arrived at their homes 2 days later with handcuffs, their lives pivoted into a nightmare. The case against them was brittle from the start. There was no physical evidence, no fingerprints, no DNA, no weapon recovered. What prosecutors had was far shakier. The testimony of 2 eyewitnesses, both of whom had caught only fleeting glimpses in the chaos of the shooting. And eyewitness testimony, as decades of research have since proven, is notoriously unreliable. Under stress, memory bends. Faces blur, details distort. But in 1994, those scientific truths weren't at the forefront of juries' minds. Back then, "I saw him" could be enough to seal a conviction. Charles and Brian were brought to the precinct separately. What unfolded in those rooms would later become a textbook example of flawed policing tactics. Detectives pressed them for hours, playing good cop and bad cop, hinting that cooperation could mean leniency, that silence could mean life behind bars. At one point, Charles asked for a lawyer. The request was brushed off. For Brian, the pressure was even worse. Detectives told him that Charles had already talked, a classic tactic meant to fracture solidarity. They implied that unless he gave them a version of events, he'd be painted as the shooter. Neither man confessed. Neither man had anything to confess. But when the lineups were arranged days later, both were picked out by witnesses. The problem? Those lineups were deeply flawed. Photos were shown alongside live participants. Suspects were made to stand out, and subtle nudges from investigators helped shape positive identifications. News traveled fast in Harlem. 2 young men, locals everyone knew, were charged with murder. Families were stunned. Neighbors whispered about the injustice of it all. Some said the police were railroading Charles and Brian to close the case quickly. Others feared speaking too loudly, worried that criticizing the police would only bring trouble. For Charles's mother, a nurse who worked long shifts, it was unbearable. She knew her son had been home the night of the shooting. She remembered him sitting at the kitchen table, eating leftovers while watching TV. But mother's words often carried little weight in courtrooms. The district attorney's office, under pressure to deliver, built their case with speed. Eyewitness testimony became the cornerstone. Prosecutors painted Charles and Brian as gang-affiliated young men who had gotten into a dispute that ended in bloodshed. They argued motive, though none was clear. They leaned heavily on the authority of the witnesses, telling the jury, "These people saw what happened." Why would they lie? The defense tried to counter. They pointed out inconsistencies in witness statements. They argued that Charles and Brian had no criminal histories. But in 1994, in a city weary of crime, juries often sided with certainty over doubt. The trial opened with packed benches, the victims' families seated in the front row, grief etched on their faces. The prosecutor delivered a sharp opening. Harlem was plagued by violence, and here were two men responsible. For Charles and Brian, sitting at the defense table, it was surreal. Both wore borrowed suits that didn't quite fit. Both glanced often toward their mothers, as if searching for anchors in a storm they couldn't escape. Witness after witness took the stand. Their accounts wavered, details shifted, descriptions blurred, but each pointed a finger at the defendants. The defense attorney tried to cross-examine, but their questions often got lost in the tide of prosecutorial confidence. When the defense presented alibis, including testimony from family members, prosecutors dismissed them as biased. The jury barely blinked. After less than 2 days of deliberation, the jury returned. The foreman stood, eyes fixed on the paper in his hand. Guilty. The word echoed in the courtroom like a gavel strike against truth. Charles Collins and Brian Boles were sentenced to decades in prison for a murder they did not commit. Their mothers wept. The young men sat frozen, as though the ground beneath them had disappeared. From that day forward, everything changed. Charles was shipped upstate to Sing Sing, Brian to another maximum security facility. Both entered prison as young men in their early 20s. They would grow into middle age behind walls of steel and concrete. Prison was its own universe. The clang of gates, the shuffle of boots on linoleum, the constant need to watch your back. For innocent men, the adjustment was brutal. Charles threw himself into books, trying to hold on to his education dreams. Brian kept to himself, avoiding trouble by blending into the background. But no matter how hard they tried, the weight of wrongful conviction was crushing. Every night, lights dimmed, they stared at ceilings, replaying the trial, wondering how the truth could have been twisted so far. Yet, outside prison walls, seeds of doubt about their case began to stir. Eyewitnesses had recanted in other wrongful conviction cases across New York. The Innocence Project was gaining traction, shining light on the fragility of eyewitness-based prosecutions. Families of Charles and Brian wrote letters, hundreds of them, to lawyers, journalists, advocacy groups. For years, those letters went unanswered. But cracks in the case, though small, were beginning to form. It would take decades before those cracks split wide open. But in 1994, as the cell doors clanged shut on Charles and Brian's first night of wrongful imprisonment, they had no way of knowing. No way of knowing that their names would one day be cleared. No way of knowing that the truth, buried under years of silence, was already beginning to stir. And no way of knowing that one witness's quiet doubt would, years later, hold the key to unlocking their freedom. The courthouse on 161st Street in Manhattan had seen thousands of cases pass through its echoing chambers. But in the spring of 1993, it became the stage for a trial that would change the lives of Charles Collins and Brian Boles forever. The two young men walked into the courtroom not as symbols of resilience or innocence, but as defendants, men already painted as guilty in the court of public opinion. The Harlem murder case had stirred fear across the community. The press fed on every detail, and the city, still reeling from years of high crime and the tough-on-crime era of politics, demanded quick justice. The prosecution's narrative was chillingly simple. Two men, driven by greed and violence, had robbed and killed a shopkeeper in Harlem. They had no hard forensic evidence. No fingerprints, no DNA, no weapon tied to the men. But they had something even more potent. Eyewitnesses, shaky but confident enough to convince a jury desperate for closure. One of the witnesses was a young woman who said she had seen two figures running from the scene that night. She admitted it had been dark, that her view was partially blocked, but under the pressure of police questioning, she pointed to photos of Collins and Boles. Later, on the stand, she hesitated for only a moment before repeating her identification. Another witness, a man with his own criminal record, testified that he had overheard Collins bragging about the crime. His deal with the prosecution, leniency on his own charges, was never disclosed fully to the jury. The jurors, mostly working-class New Yorkers, leaned heavily on these testimonies. After all, why would someone risk perjury unless they were telling the truth? What they didn't know was how fragile and fallible memory can be, especially when nudged by investigators eager for convictions. The defense attorneys for Collins and Boles were overmatched. Public defenders, stretched thin with overwhelming caseloads, had neither the resources nor the time to build the robust defense their clients deserved. They challenged the inconsistencies in the eyewitness accounts, but without expert testimony on memory fallibility, the jury never heard the science. Collins and Boles both testified in their own defense. They told the court they were not there that night, that they had nothing to do with the killing. Collins recalled being at his cousin's apartment. Boles said he was with friends several blocks away. But alibis without corroboration meant little. The prosecution painted them as liars, their words as rehearsed stories. What struck observers, even some reporters, was the sheer imbalance of power. The state had the machinery of law enforcement, prosecutors, and witnesses, while the two defendants stood alone, handcuffed by circumstance. After 2 weeks of testimony and arguments, the case went to the jury. The deliberations were surprisingly brief. Less than 2 days later, the foreperson announced the verdict. Guilty. The words crashed through the room like a thunderclap. Collins's mother gasped audibly. Boles lowered his head, his shoulders shaking. Both men mouthed the same words. I didn't do it. The judge delivered the sentences with a detached calm that belied the gravity of the moment. 25 years to life for each man. The weight of the gavel striking would seem to mark not just the end of the trial, but the beginning of a nightmare neither could have imagined. The next morning, headlines blared. Harlem killers convicted. Justice served in brutal murder. The narrative was neat, digestible, and deeply misleading. For the city, it was closure. For Collins and Boles, it was the erasure of their lives as they knew them. Reporters moved on to the next crime story. But in Harlem, whispers of doubt lingered. Some community members questioned whether the police had rushed to judgment. Others wondered why no physical evidence tied the men to the scene. But these doubts never reached the courtroom, and certainly not the jury. Collins and Boles were shipped off to upstate prisons, places far from Harlem, far from their families. Letters from loved ones became their lifelines. Days bled into nights. Both men became numbers in a system designed to forget them. For the families, the pain was unbearable. Mothers who once dreamed of seeing their sons build families and careers now spent weekends on long bus rides to correctional facilities, watching time wither away behind glass partitions. Still, in their hearts, Collins and Boles clung to hope. They had faith that one day, someone would see the truth, that the system that had buried them might one day dig them back out. But as years stretched into decades, that hope grew harder to hold. What no one knew, not the jury, not the press, not even the defense, was that buried deep in the case files lay evidence that could have unraveled the prosecution's entire story. Evidence that had been overlooked or perhaps deliberately concealed. It would take 30 years for that truth to emerge. The trial of Charles Collins and Brian Boles was more than a legal proceeding. It was a stage play, a performance where truth was secondary to winning. Harlem residents lined up outside the courthouse, some out of curiosity, others out of fear, and many with the quiet hope that justice would prevail. Instead, what unfolded was a case study in how a system designed to protect the innocent can be bent to secure convictions. The prosecution opened with confidence, painting the two young men as predators who had terrorized Harlem. They spoke with certainty, not hesitation, describing the crime as if they had witnessed it firsthand. A star witness, shaky and inconsistent, was presented as the linchpin. The jury leaned forward. This witness claimed to have seen Collins and Boles near the crime scene. Yet under the surface, cracks ran deep, timelines that didn't match, details that shifted with every retelling, and a history of questionable credibility. But in the courtroom, credibility isn't always about facts. It's about performance. And the prosecutor's performance was airtight. The defense attorneys, overworked, underpaid, and under-resourced, fought uphill. They tried to raise doubts: the lack of DNA, the absence of fingerprints, the reliance on shaky testimony. But their voices were often drowned out by objections, sustained with a quick rap of the judge's gavel. At one point, Collins whispered to his lawyer, "But that's not true. That didn't happen." His lawyer only nodded, eyes heavy, as if silently saying, "We both know, but they don't care." Brian Boles sat quietly, his hands clasped, eyes fixed downward. To the jury, he may have looked cold or detached. To those who knew him, it was the look of a man who understood the game was rigged. Silence was his armor. But in a courtroom where demeanor is scrutinized as much as evidence, his quietness worked against him. The prosecution seized on it. Look at him. Not a word of denial. Not a flicker of remorse. Ladies and gentlemen, this is the face of guilt. The jury shifted in their seats. A seed had been planted. Presiding over it all was a judge who rarely tilted in favor of the defense. Motions to suppress unreliable witness testimony? Denied. Requests for additional time to locate alibi witnesses? Denied. Appeals to introduce evidence that might have shifted the narrative? Shut down before they could take root. Courtrooms are supposed to be arenas of fairness. This one felt like a funnel, every path narrowing toward conviction. 12 men and women sat in silence, tasked with the impossible, to decide the fate of two young black men based on fractured stories and selective evidence. Some jurors looked uneasy. Others avoided eye contact with the defendants. Bias, even unspoken, seeped into the room like smoke. The closing argument from the prosecution was fiery. They didn't just tell the jury Collins and Boles were guilty. They told them the community needed a verdict to feel safe again. Fear, not evidence, became the glue of the case. As the trial neared its end, Charles and Brian began to sense what was coming. Family members in the gallery held hands, whispering prayers under their breath. The defense gave their final plea. These men are innocent. The evidence does not prove guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. But their words felt like a whisper in a hurricane. When the jury was dismissed to deliberate, the courtroom was left in an unbearable silence. Hours passed. Then, a signal. The jury had reached a decision. Charles leaned toward Brian. "They didn't even take a day," he muttered, dread curling in his stomach. The courtroom doors opened. The jurors filed in. Faces blank. No smiles. No tears. Just the heavy weight of a verdict ready to be delivered. The judge asked the foreperson, "Has the jury reached a unanimous verdict?" The answer, "Yes, Your Honor." The words that followed would seal the fate of two innocent men for decades to come. The foreperson unfolded a slip of paper and read aloud, "We, the jury, find the defendants." The courtroom in Lower Manhattan was a machine, polished and relentless. Hundreds of cases streamed through each week, faces blending into faces, names into names, each defendant often reduced to a docket number and a time slot. For Charles Collins and Brian Boles, their day in court was supposed to be the moment where everything would be laid bare, where the evidence against them would be scrutinized, where their innocence could shine through. Instead, what unfolded was less a trial of truth than a performance choreographed for conviction. The trial began in the fall of 1992, less than a year after the shooting that had shaken Harlem. From the outset, the courtroom felt like hostile terrain. The prosecution arrived with confidence, armed not with forensic evidence, but with the weight of narrative. They had a story to tell, a story of two young black men who, they insisted, had committed a senseless act of violence. There was no physical evidence, no fingerprints, no murder weapon, no DNA, nothing that tied either man directly to the crime scene. But what the prosecution had, what they clung to, was testimony. Human memory, fragile and fallible, became the foundation of the state's case. The star witness was a man who claimed to have seen Charles and Brian near the scene on the night of the shooting. He told the jury he remembered their faces, their clothes, their movements. But what jurors never learned was that this identification had been anything but reliable. He had initially failed to pick them out of a lineup. His testimony had shifted over time, details bending under the weight of police suggestion and prosecutorial coaching. For Charles, sitting at the defense table, it felt surreal. He leaned over to his attorney during the testimony, whispering, "This doesn't even match what I was wearing that night." His lawyer squeezed his shoulder in reassurance, but said nothing to the jury. Brian, seated beside him, felt the same gnawing dread. He watched the jurors scribble notes, as if what they were hearing was gospel truth. They're eating it up, he thought. The defense attempted to poke holes in the testimony. They highlighted inconsistencies, questioned memory lapses, and pressed the witness on why his story had changed so many times. But the judge often cut these lines of questioning short. Objections from the prosecution, asked and answered, irrelevant, badgering, were routinely sustained. It was as though the trial had been set on rails, and no amount of resistance could knock it off course. The assistant district attorney painted a vivid picture in closing arguments. He spoke not of evidence, but of fear and order. Harlem, he said, was under siege from crime, from young men who believed they could act without consequence. He pointed at Charles and Brian, casting them as avatars of that chaos. This case, he declared, is about restoring safety to this community. These men thought they could take a life and walk away. Today, you tell them, and you tell Harlem, that you will not let that stand. It was rhetoric designed to inflame, to appeal not to reason but to emotion. The jury nodded, some visibly moved. The defense, by contrast, seemed muted. They spoke of the lack of evidence, of the contradictions, of the fact that Charles and Brian had alibis. But their words felt small against the prosecution's towering narrative. Without forensic proof to wave in front of the jury, their case rested on reason alone. And reason, in that courtroom, seemed outmatched. Through it all, the family sat in the gallery, watching helplessly. Charles's mother clutched a small Bible, whispering prayers under her breath. Brian's sister scribbled notes feverishly, convinced she could piece together inconsistencies no one else seemed to care about. When the verdict was read, the room went silent. Guilty, first Charles, then Brian. The words rang out like a gavel strike against their very lives. Their mothers sobbed. Their siblings shouted. Bailiffs rushed to quiet the chaos. Charles's knees buckled as though the floor had given way beneath him. Brian stared straight ahead, numb, as if his body refused to register what had just happened. They were sentenced to decades behind bars, effectively life in prison. The judge spoke of deterrence, of accountability, of justice served. To Charles and Brian, it felt like a script written long before they ever walked into the courtroom. In prison, the trial became a recurring nightmare. Both men replayed it over and over in their minds, dissecting each moment, each word. How could they convict us with nothing? Charles would ask, pacing the cell block. They didn't need something, Brian would reply quietly. They just needed us. For years, the trial stood as a wall between them and freedom. Appeals were filed and denied. New lawyers tried to take up their cause, but often lacked resources. The system had moved on. For the courts, the case was closed. But outside prison walls, cracks in the foundation were beginning to show. Advocacy groups started reviewing old cases, digging into the flaws of eyewitness testimony, the dangers of prosecutorial misconduct, the biases that tainted trials in the 1990s. Charles and Brian's case, long buried, began to resurface. It wasn't until decades later that the real turning point appeared. A review of the original case files revealed what had been hidden. Notes from the lead detective showing doubts about the witnesses' reliability, alternate suspects who had never been pursued, even a tip that suggested someone else had confessed. But none of this had been shared with the defense. It was a bombshell, evidence of Brady violations, a constitutional breach that required prosecutors to turn over exculpatory evidence. When this discovery reached Charles and Brian in prison, it was both a moment of triumph and despair. Triumph, because it proved what they had been saying all along. The trial had been a sham. Despair, because they had already lost decades of their lives. The next step was clear. Their legal team would file for a hearing, arguing that the convictions had been built on lies and concealment. But as they prepared their case, they encountered a chilling obstacle. The prosecution's office, rather than admit fault, doubled down. They insisted the convictions were sound. They claimed the evidence would not have changed the outcome. They argued that after so many years, justice had already been served. And so the stage was set again, not for a trial of guilt or innocence, but for a trial of truth versus power. Would the courts finally listen? Or would Charles Collins and Brian Boles be condemned to live out their lives behind bars, victims not just of wrongful conviction, but of a system unwilling to admit its mistakes? The answer lay just beyond the horizon, an appeal that could either shatter the walls of injustice or seal them shut forever. The Harlem courthouse had become more than just a building of law. It was a fortress of memory, grief, and resistance. For Charles Collins and Brian Boles, every appearance inside its walls was both a punishment and a prayer. Their lives had been decided there decades ago, and now, after years of obscurity and broken appeals, the same courthouse might hold their last hope of freedom. But the journey to this moment had been anything but straightforward. Throughout the 1990s and 2000s, both men had tried, unsuccessfully, to challenge their convictions. Appeals were filed, motions rejected, and hearings dismissed. In the courtroom transcripts, the denials had a mechanical rhythm: motion denied, evidence insufficient, petition dismissed. It was like screaming into a void, Brian later recalled in an interview. You pour your heart into a petition, and the judge writes 3 sentences that slam the door shut. And then you start all over again, with less hope than before. For Charles, the rejection was personal. Each time he was denied, he felt not just the weight of prison bars, but the confirmation that the system didn't care. You start to believe you're invisible, he said. Like your life doesn't matter. Like the truth doesn't matter. Yet, through those years, they both clung to the idea that justice delayed wasn't necessarily justice denied. Somewhere, somehow, the truth would surface. By the late 2000s, technology was changing the landscape of wrongful convictions across the U.S. DNA testing, once rare and expensive, became a weapon for the innocent. Organizations like the Innocence Project were using science to dismantle flawed prosecutions that had relied on eyewitness testimony, coerced confessions, and shaky forensic methods. Charles and Brian's cases had all the hallmarks of wrongful convictions. No physical evidence linking them to the crime, testimony riddled with contradictions, and an investigation marred by tunnel vision. Yet for years, the case file gathered dust. It wasn't until 2018, nearly 4 decades after their arrests, that advocates finally took another look. A small coalition of lawyers, students, and activists began digging into the Harlem case. They discovered something shocking: boxes of evidence that had never been tested with modern DNA methods. Inside those boxes were items from the original crime scene: bloodstains, hair samples, and clothing that could finally tell the truth. But would the system allow it? The Manhattan District Attorney's Office didn't rush to cooperate. Prosecutors argued that the evidence had degraded over time, that testing might be unreliable, that reopening the case would re-traumatize victims. Behind those arguments was another, unspoken fear. If the tests proved Collins and Boles innocent, it would expose the state's failure. The defense team filed motion after motion, demanding access to the evidence. The DA's office delayed, appealed, and resisted. Meanwhile, Charles and Brian were aging behind bars. Brian, who had once been a wiry young man with restless energy, now walked with a stiffness that betrayed years of confinement. Charles, once known for his easy laugh, had developed a cautious silence. Both carried the physical scars of decades in one of New York's harshest prisons. "They always told us the truth doesn't expire," Charles said in a recorded call from prison. "But they act like justice has an expiration date." In 2021, after relentless pressure, a judge ordered the evidence to be tested. When the results came back, they were explosive. The DNA found on the crime scene items didn't match either Charles Collins or Brian Boles. Instead, it pointed toward other individuals, people the original investigation had ignored. It was a moment of vindication, but also of rage. For Charles, the results brought tears, but not relief. "I thought about my mom, who died while I was in here. I thought about the years I missed with my kids. And I thought, if this evidence had been tested in 1981, none of this would have happened." For Brian, the results were a lifeline. "Finally," he said, "finally, someone besides us is saying we didn't do this." But even with DNA evidence clearing their names, freedom didn't come immediately. Prosecutors insisted that DNA alone wasn't enough to exonerate. They clung to the old eyewitness testimonies, shaky as they were, and argued the convictions should stand. It was a battle between science and stubbornness, and it was playing out in slow motion. By now, both men were in their late 60s. Prison life had left deep marks. Charles had battled chronic illness, and Brian had suffered years of untreated medical issues. Both had seen friends die inside, men who, like them, had been fighting for justice that never came. Their families, too, bore the scars. Children grew up without fathers. Sisters and brothers carried the stigma of having a loved one labeled a murderer. Relationships strained, some broke entirely. Yet, in the Harlem neighborhood where the case had first unfolded, a growing movement was forming. Community leaders began to speak out, pointing to Charles and Brian's cases as symbols of a broader injustice, a system that disproportionately punished black men, often on the flimsiest of evidence. At rallies, their names were chanted. On murals, their faces appeared. The case was no longer just about two men. It was about Harlem itself and the generations of families torn apart by wrongful convictions. By early 2023, the fight had reached a climax. After months of legal wrangling, a hearing was set to determine whether the convictions of Charles Collins and Brian Boles would be vacated. In the packed courtroom, lawyers laid out the evidence: the absence of DNA linking the men to the crime, the contradictions in witness testimony, the misconduct in the original investigation. The prosecutors countered with a familiar refrain: memory may fade, but the original jury's decision should stand. Observers were struck by the surreal nature of the proceedings. Two men who had spent nearly 5 decades in prison, who had lived through the rise and fall of entire political eras, were still being asked to prove their innocence. "They've already lost their lives," one advocate whispered outside the courtroom. "This is just about giving them back their dignity." On July 2025, the judge finally announced that a decision would be rendered. The courtroom filled once again: family, activists, journalists, and supporters, all waiting for the words that could change everything. Charles and Brian sat side by side, their hands trembling slightly, their eyes fixed on the bench. For nearly half a century, they had lived in the shadow of a crime they didn't commit. Now, with the stroke of a pen, that shadow could finally lift, or grow darker still. As the judge cleared his throat and prepared to read the ruling, the entire room held its breath. The calendar read 1995, but for Charles Collins and Brian Boles, time felt frozen somewhere in the late 1980s, the night Harlem turned on them. They had already been behind bars for years, their names chained to a crime they swore they did not commit. Yet, despite the decades passing, despite shifts in politics, police leadership, and community energy, their case seemed lodged like a shard in Harlem's collective memory. But there was one truth that made this case unique: it refused to vanish. Some wrongful convictions fade into forgotten court files, collecting dust in a box buried in some courthouse basement. Collins and Boles' case was different. It lingered in whispers across neighborhoods, resurfaced in appeals, and quietly drew attention from journalists and advocates unwilling to let it disappear. By the mid-1990s, the hope of a swift legal remedy had all but evaporated. The men had exhausted their direct appeals. Habeas petitions had failed. Judges routinely wrote cold dismissals, their language clinical. The conviction stands. The system had a way of punishing persistence. For every motion filed, there came the reminder: courts didn't like reopening old wounds. Prosecutors clung to the narrative that the jury had spoken, the evidence had been tested, and justice had been served. To question the verdict was to question the integrity of the state itself. But the families of Collins and Boles refused to surrender. Their mothers in particular became relentless forces. "My son is innocent," Charles's mother would repeat to anyone who would listen: church members, neighbors, even strangers on the subway. Brian's family wrote letters, hundreds of them, to lawyers, to advocacy groups, to politicians. For years, those letters were ignored. It was like screaming into the wind. Meanwhile, Harlem itself was changing. By the late 1990s, the neighborhood that had once been described in the language of crisis, crack epidemic, crime waves, unemployment, was beginning to see the first signs of gentrification. Brownstones that once sat vacant now drew buyers. Coffee shops replaced corner bodegas. Developers described Harlem as up and coming. But beneath the real estate ads and glossy photographs, scars remained. Families like the Collinses and the Boleses knew firsthand how deeply the justice system had wounded their community. And for Harlem, the wrongful conviction of 2 young black men was not just a tragedy. It was a reminder of how fragile safety and justice truly were. The case became a kind of ghost story locals told newcomers. "Do you remember those boys who said they didn't do it?" Older residents would ask. Some recalled the trial, the shaky testimony, the way the police seemed too eager for a conviction. Others had forgotten the details, but remembered the feeling that something about it never sat right. At the same time, across the country, a revolution in criminal justice was unfolding. DNA testing was proving, case after case, that wrongful convictions weren't rare accidents. They were systemic failures. In 1989, Gary Dotson became the first person exonerated by DNA evidence. By the late 1990s, dozens followed. Innocence projects were forming in universities and legal clinics, exposing a terrifying truth. Eyewitnesses were often wrong, confessions were sometimes coerced, and prosecutors sometimes hid evidence. For Collins and Boles, this was the first glimmer of hope in years. Their supporters began asking, if DNA could clear strangers in other states, could it clear them too? But there was a cruel hitch. Evidence from their Harlem case had supposedly been lost. The rape kit, the clothing, the forensic samples, gone. Misplaced, destroyed, or perhaps never properly preserved. Without that evidence, DNA couldn't prove their innocence. It was a dead end, or so it seemed. Then came a turning point. Around 2003, a young law student at Columbia stumbled across their case while researching wrongful convictions in New York. Something about it grabbed her: the shaky eyewitness testimony, the lack of physical evidence, the relentless insistence of innocence. She contacted the families, sat with them in cramped apartments, listened to their stories. And then she asked the question no one had asked in years. What if the evidence isn't gone? What if it's buried in a police locker somewhere? That seed of doubt ignited a new fight. The law student connected the families with an Innocence Project lawyer who filed formal requests to locate any remaining evidence. For months, silence. Then, a whisper of progress. Boxes of files had been located in an NYPD storage facility in Queens. The paperwork was incomplete, mislabeled, but there were hints, just hints, that biological evidence might still exist. For Collins and Boles, it was like oxygen after years of suffocation. But nothing moved quickly. DNA testing in those years was expensive, and backlogs stretched for months, sometimes years. Prosecutors resisted, arguing that finality mattered more than relitigating an old case. Judges fretted about reopening wounds. And so, the men waited. Charles filled his time by writing letters, poems, journal entries that captured his anger, but also his hope. Brian leaned on faith, attending every prison Bible study, clinging to the idea that truth, eventually, would surface. Their families, meanwhile, became investigators. They tracked down old witnesses, begged journalists to pay attention, gathered every scrap of forgotten paperwork. What emerged was a portrait of a prosecution riddled with doubt. Witnesses who had been pressured, inconsistencies that had been ignored, timelines that didn't add up. Still, freedom remained out of reach. Finally, in the late 2000s, a test result came back, not definitive, but suggestive. Biological evidence from the scene excluded both Collins and Boles. The DNA belonged to someone else. It should have been a bombshell. Instead, prosecutors downplayed it. They argued it didn't matter, that DNA didn't negate eyewitness testimony. They suggested the evidence could have been contaminated, mishandled. It was another cruel delay. But the truth was now in motion, and truth has a way of gathering momentum. By 2010, wrongful convictions had become a national conversation. Netflix and NPR were not yet producing the high-profile true crime documentaries we know today, but investigative journalists were beginning to shine light on these stories. Across the country, audiences were realizing that the justice system wasn't infallible. And in Harlem, community leaders began raising the case again, this time with new urgency. If they didn't do it, one activist told a reporter, then the real perpetrator has been free all these years. That should terrify us. The story was no longer just about Collins and Boles. It was about Harlem itself, about the integrity of justice in New York, about how many lives could be upended by a single error. By the time Collins and Boles had each served over 3 decades, their case had become too loud to ignore. Journalists revisited it. Law clinics wrote reports. Advocates staged rallies outside courthouses. What had once been a forgotten case was now a symbol, and symbols, once ignited, are difficult to extinguish. Still, in prison cells upstate, Charles and Brian continued to live the same daily grind. Counts, chow lines, cold steel bunks. The outside momentum didn't erase the isolation of confinement. Each time a lawyer promised progress, they tempered hope with caution. They had been disappointed too many times before. Yet this time felt different. Something was building. Something was about to break. On a humid summer day in 2018, a sealed envelope landed on the desk of an attorney working with the Innocence Project. Inside was a lab result that had been delayed for months. The DNA profile had been uploaded into the national database. And this time, there was a match. Not to Collins, not to Boles, to someone else, someone with a violent past. The name was there, typed in black ink. And when the attorney read it, she felt her stomach drop. Because this name had been in the case file all along. When the gavel finally fell, it did not just mark the end of a trial. It marked the end of a lifetime of stolen years. Charles Collins and Brian Boles walked free from the Harlem courthouse in July 2025, blinking against the light, their families waiting with trembling arms and tears that refused to stop. Reporters swarmed, microphones thrust forward, but for Charles and Brian, the noise of the crowd was distant. What mattered was the air, the free air, that filled their lungs for the first time in decades. Their story is not only one of injustice, but of survival. They endured prison walls that sought to break them, endured being forgotten by a system that failed them, endured the silence of a world that moved on. Yet here they stood, proof that truth, though buried for years, can rise again. But their freedom does not erase the years stolen. Charles will never get back the family dinners, the birthdays, the long Harlem nights spent on the stoop laughing with friends. Brian will never regain the youthful years when his dreams stretched ahead of him. What they have now is the second half of life, fragile but fiercely protected, and the possibility to use their voices so no one else endures what they endured. The exoneration of Charles Collins and Brian Boles sent shockwaves across New York and the nation. It was a reminder, wrongful convictions are not relics of the past. They are alive, happening now, in neighborhoods just like Harlem. Their case forces us to ask, how many more men and women are still waiting for their freedom, still clinging to the hope that someone will believe them? As Charles said on the courthouse steps, we lost decades. But if our story saves even one life from being stolen the way ours was, then we won't be forgotten. Their story is over, but the fight for justice is not. If you believe in truth, in reform, in giving the silence their voices back, share this story. Support organizations like the Innocence Project. Talk about wrongful convictions with your friends and family. Because behind every headline is a human life waiting to be heard. This was Innocence Uncovered. Stay with us as we continue to tell the stories that matter. The ones that force us to ask hard questions, and the ones that remind us what freedom really means. Backhand index pointing right, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe so these voices reach as far as they deserve to. Together, we can make sure injustice never hides in the shadows again.